would make more sense.
I'll never try that. I told the clock hospital
Yeah.
I think. You kind of like the. And I need to start. Yeah. It's supposed to get up to this one.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we get started with the material for today, just one very quick note, which is that so on Wednesday, you're going to be having a third and final quiz. And again, unless there's some unusual circumstance, I intend to offer in class. All right, but again, if there's a possibility of any issue, illness, or things like that, please get in touch with me. Otherwise, in the normal circumstance, I'll just have that one in class. Right, that's on Wednesday. Okay. Today, what we're going to have a lecture. Really is a very broad theme, which is a conflict in the Muslim world. It really is going to encompass several different combatants and several different battles. So I'll try my best to keep them all straight. All right. What we're going to see is starting at right around year 1000, although even more so after that. The Muslim world, the world that we had said had once been one of the strongest, most united, both politically and militarily, one of the commanding forces at this time, is going to start to change significantly. Really, what we're going to see then is because the caliphate, the great empire of the Muslim world, is no longer going to be as unified as it once was. It's going to open up the door now for all sorts of confusions on many different levels. Really, in fact, that is going to create a vacuum of power that is going to allow many of the conflicts we'll talk about today to take place. None of this is to say that Islam itself goes anywhere. The religion itself is extremely strong. And even as politically speaking, this world is such a very Islam is really going to be the only thing that holds many of these territories together. But that's not enough, of course, to have one sort of government. And in fact, what we begin to see now is all of what had previously been one large caliphate is going to begin to split up into much smaller little sections. And in fact, these are going to rule over smaller areas that had once been the United Empire Caliphate. And in some cases, they're going to grow up as to be relatively strong and respectable governments. In other cases, we're going to see things that are much stranger and smaller growing up. Just give you some idea of some of these strange splinter groups that begin to grow up once there is no longer a commanding caliph in charge. One of the most interesting groups that would grow up in several places in the Middle East, including modern-day Iraq, is a group known as the Assassins. This is one of the main strongholds of the Assassins. They often built these sort of very elaborate sort of structures to keep out outsiders. The Assassins were a group whose political program was very simple. They simply just went out and killed anyone who disagreed with them politically. It's a simple political program, but one that's very easy to understand. To be fair to the Assassins too, they would kill those who were not Muslim, who they disagreed with. But to be fair, they also killed Muslims that they disagreed with. Any ruler who went against their very sort of harsh, uncompromising view of Islam. Sometimes those people who study the roots of words try to figure out where the root of the term assassin comes from in this group. And what they tend to come up with, the major theory, is that it comes from this. It comes from the drug hashish, which in effect, in some parts of the world, is one of the major ways people get THC, marijuana. The same thing with marijuana, but in a slightly different form. Hashish, street name Hash, in case you're curious. Hope that isn't more useful. This drug supposedly was given to foot soldiers in the Assassins. It was given in such a degree that they would get them hooked, and supposedly then they'd be able to do any mission, including the suicide missions that their foot soldiers were often required to do. That's in fact the real etymology of this term. Now, not all Muslim groups at this time were quite as crazy, perhaps, as the Assassins, but there really is absolutely no head now of the Muslim community. So what does this lead to? Well, a new force begins to burst into many of those territories that were ruled over by Muslims. This is a new group that we've seen previously some of their ancestors fighting in China. But this is a group that would be the ancestors to the modern-day Turks. And they will begin to attack many places in the Muslim world because they have no strong leadership. And in fact, they begin to seize control of portions of the Middle East. In time, the Turks who came and burst into the scene without a strong religious preference are going to turn towards Islam. And just to give you some idea of, in a short period of time, how much territory the Turks were able to take in one form or another. This map in this sort of this orangish color shows you some of the areas that the Turks ended up taking in a very short period of time. What was very weird about the Turks in some ways is that they too did not have a very strong central leader or emperor. They were basically, even after taking this territory, they were a confederacy of tribes. So this kind of creaky leadership style, but they also were very good at conquering things, to destruction in their past. In this situation in which, very strangely for Islam, the break had been made between what we might refer to as church and state, or government really, and religion. The two of these had really broken apart very thoroughly in Islam. at this point, because these Turks were very good at conquering, much less they were newcomers to the faith, they didn't provide much guidance. And so increasingly, the heavy load of how to guide Muslims entirely falls upon religious members of the Muslim community. This is when we begin to see these people known as the ulama, these Muslim teachers and religious leaders, people whose job was to interpret the Quran, to make judgments in the community, to help organize communities in the Muslim world. They become even more dominant in many regions because there's still people who want to know what to do in their lives based upon Islam, but really there's very little guidance from above. And if anything, really, it's the guidance of these people and Islam that keeps together many Muslim territories, rather than now anything like a government that really was dominated by Muslim ideals. But we do think altogether that the Turks were very good at conquering. They did not have huge numbers. They were thin on the ground. And in many of those places, even though I showed you a moment on the map that they had conquered, they don't really have any loyalty by anyone that they had taken. And so it's kind of a strange lack of structure still, even after now there's a new people theoretically ruling over this territory. Now, the Turks and all of their conquests end up actually creating an entirely new problem for the Muslim world, though no one saw it at first. And it's especially because some of the territories that the Turks would end up taking, if you look closely here, are in what today is modern-day Israel, including some of the important holy sites of Christianity in those territories. I'm showing here an image of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the church that, among other things, houses the spot where Jesus was said to have lain before he was resurrected. So this site and many others like it had always been a popular spot for Christians. I mean, and Christian pilgrims had always come to this area. So why is this relevant? Well, we think the Turks were late converts, and like people who convert late in life to a religion, they became overly zealous. And to some degree, the old attitudes of many Muslim leaders, which is like, leave pilgrims alone. People are allowed to go and to venerate these sites. That was not necessarily the ideal that the Turks shared. And in fact, the Turks actually begin to get in the way of the pilgrims. They make their lives much more difficult. They make it difficult for pilgrims to come and to venerate these important sites for Christians. On top of that, so they're already irritating some Christians just who want to worship, but they're also going after one of the major Christian empires, which we talked about in class, the Byzantine Empire, especially in what today is modern-day Turkey. In effect, the Turks begin this series of brutal attacks against the Byzantines. In fact, especially after some of the very sort of the overwhelming defeats at the hands of Turks, there was some fear now in the Byzantine world that a lot of their good territory was being eaten up, and perhaps now they were in a place where their empire was being put in serious jeopardy. It is at this time that, although the Byzantines and the people in Western Europe hated one another generally, and there had already been that religious split or schism between the Byzantines and the Western Europeans. So under normal circumstances, the Byzantines generally wanted nothing to do with Western Europeans. In this case, though, that they felt that there was an existential threat to their empire. And there was fear that if someone didn't come to help them, who knows what might happen. And so the Byzantine emperor decides to swallow his pride, and he sends a delegation to Western Europe. And who does he go to? Well, at this time, he doesn't want to just go to one European leader, which would be inefficient. So he goes to the only thing like kind of a UN that exists in Western Europe at the time, which is the Pope. And so they send a delegation to the Pope. This, by the way, this Pope is not a very good likeness. This is the best as I can do. This is Pope Urban II. He is by far the most influential pope you probably have never heard of before this point. Because Urban II here, who otherwise does not have a remarkable career, his brainchild at this moment is to start an entirely new movement based upon this appeal from Byzantines and the appeal for help in the Byzantine world. And in effect, he is the one who first gets the idea, let's, yes, of course, let's go help the Byzantines. But Urban II had a much more expansive view of what these armies could do once they went over into the Middle East. Let's not just help the Byzantines. Let's take back some of these holy territories for Christianity. In fact, probably more than anyone else, it's Urban II now who not only comes up with this new dream, really, he begins to openly preach it. And this is a movement that he really summons into being. Now, Urban II could say, as you saw in some of the speeches that you've read, and some of these speeches, you get up there, especially in this main one in France, in Clermont, and he would say things like, listen, yes, we've had our differences with the Byzantines, but they're still our brothers. They're still Christian brothers. We have to come to their aid at this time of desperation. In addition, though, then he made this twist to say that in addition to simply helping our brothers, we can also recover some of the great sites like Jerusalem that have been lost to Christians for so long. They can now come back into our grasp. Now, what's so interesting about this is that it's fair to say that what Urban II was preaching, this crusade idea, had absolutely nothing to do with the Byzantines and what the Byzantines wanted. What the Byzantine emperor had said originally is like, listen, I want a group of battle-ready knights, people who had arms, horses, that can go and help me on the battlefield immediately. And he would reward them monetarily, but never did the Byzantines have anything like a religious war in mind. That simply was not their goal. They wanted to get back their land, primarily. But that's not what Westerners really ended up wanting. Initially, and just to show you just how indiscriminately he had made this call, the Pope made the call, some of the people who end up really getting excited by this idea are people who never should have been on the battlefield originally. And in fact, some of the earliest recruits to the Crusades were people who in fact were peasants, people who in some cases had no weapons, among other problems. They had no money to fund an expedition. And so, in fact, even before the Crusade is really properly organized, there's actually this group of sort of fresh recruits who goes over and goes to try to counter the Turks in battle. And very quickly, the Turks make mincemeat of them, chop them all apart. This manuscript, for instance, is all shown as martyrs in white, some of these early sort of combatants, where it's really a proper army put together. Even after this initial setback, though, we do see that there's real enthusiasm in the West for taking back some of these holy territories. And again, this ideal really begins to shoot through people that not only would be nice to go back on pilgrimage again, which is love, but this idea of piety is saying that let's go to the place where Jesus himself walked, and other holy people. That it wasn't enough anymore just to think about these things from afar. They wanted to actually see them in person. And so many great nobles, although interestingly enough, in the first wave, not any kings, begin to put together the first crusade. And they decide to march over then to the Middle East. It is fair to say that this first crusade had chosen a fantastic time to attack the Muslim world. Not because they had planned anything in advance. They had almost no idea what they were getting themselves into. The reason that it was a great time was exactly the conditions we had talked about at the beginning of the class, which is to say, there were no great Muslim sort of governments or armies at the time, which is to say there were all these small, scattered armies, which meant, in fact, that even an army that was not huge in size could actually begin to do some serious damage in the Muslim world. And that's what it did. And we think that very quickly, to their credit, some of these Western Europeans who go on crusade learn the Turks' battle strategy, which is to say, stay at a distance, shoot arrows. Western Europeans learn that their greatest weapon is essentially to charge Turks as much as possible, get right in their face, and they had the skills to do that. Their battle strategy the entire time was just attack as soon as possible. And in fact, this proves to be very successful. And because there could be no one unified Muslim army at the time, they could keep picking off all of these different groups that come to people. We see that altogether, the Western European army will conquer a series of cities, the culmination of the many cities they attack, which roughly altogether is about the size of modern-day Israel today. And then they finally come to the holy city itself, Jerusalem, and they end up laying siege to it. The Crusaders will then, when they finally manage to burst into Jerusalem, it's been a long, difficult route to get there, they decided that they would take no prisoners. Upon bursting into the city of Jerusalem, they proceeded to slaughter the entire population of the city, to the point where, according to some chroniclers, blood flowed down the city up to people's ankles, which may be an exaggeration, but there were a lot of dead people after this had happened. And just to give you some idea, by the way, in actually one of the Holy Sepulchre of the church, many of the Crusaders who came would then carve these little crosses in as a sign that they had reached Jerusalem. At this point, the Western Europeans decide to create their own kingdom in the Middle East, on the model of European kingdoms back in Europe. They had their own king, who, as you can see here, was crowned. They had a system of supply set up because most of their neighbors hated them. They ended up having a lot of Italian shipping. So Italian ships would come in and supply their kingdom. They had all sorts of nobles who held land from the king, just like in Western Europe. Here's some of the European ships that would come in. Some of these ships were good for trading as well. They would just take goods back to Western Europe to trade. There was a real problem, though, that this new kingdom in the Middle East, this Christian kingdom now, runs into immediately, which is to say, defense is always going to prove to be a huge problem because they simply don't have enough people on the ground to defend themselves. And so the brainchild, really, of this kingdom is to come up with an entirely new fighting force. Now, many of the people who had fought in the First Crusade, if they lived, would end up heading back to Western Europe, and they had fulfilled their vows to go on crusade, and they had no desire to live there. But they end up deciding that the only way to defend this is to have an entirely new military force that is known as the Knights Templar when they first come into being. And their name comes from the site of the Jewish temple. That's where actually their headquarters were. The Knights Templar, it's a very interesting sort of body because the Knights Templar were in effect monks. But unlike your normal, ordinary, boring monks who just sit there and working and praying all day long, the primary mission and statement of the Knights Templar is to fight. They take other vows, like for instance, they give up money and sex, and they're supposed to be obedient. But their main job is to fight. They start off simply being as basically police escorts for pilgrims, but later on, the Knights Templar become one of the primary lines of defense, both organizing other fighters and themselves fighting to help preserve the kingdom against other Muslim adversaries. Interestingly enough, the Knights Templar will, in time, like many monastic orders, become filthy rich because all sorts of nobles will begin to give them land. In some cases, people who really wanted to go on crusade but couldn't go themselves, they'd simply give money to fund the expeditions of the Knights Templar. In fact, they had land all around Europe as well to support their activities in the Holy Land. In effect, as time goes on, you'll begin to see all sorts of drips and drabs of Western Europeans who will come to the Middle East to go on crusading. And sometimes these newcomers are some of the biggest problems, really, thorns in the side of the people who live there now. Because as soon as, in some cases, these new fighters were so radical, they basically want to go on the battlefield immediately, like, all right, killing some Muslims. And people who live there would have to be like, all right, let's actually think about who we're going to attack next. And this is probably not a good idea to attack this group because we're allied with them. And but they had no idea, just coming over for the first time, about all these things. Another major crusade, what's known as the Second Crusade, would later be preached. This time, the crusade would end up having not one but two kings would sign on. Both the kings of France and Germany. This crusade ends up proving to be a massive failure, in part because one of those kings I mentioned ended up dying, and also in part because one of the main goals of this crusade was to take the city of Damascus here in modern-day Syria, and in fact, this was a stupid idea because Damascus had previously been friendly to the Christian kingdom. And they also failed to take the city. So this becomes a complete disaster. What was very interesting, though, is that after Christians, this new kingdom had been in the Middle East for a long amount of time, what ended up happening, again, against really all expectations, is Christians being there had actually created something for Muslims to rally against. There's very little Muslims at this time could agree on, but one thing that they knew is that they wanted to get these newcomers out, especially again because they were Christians, of their territories. And in fact, it's exactly these kind of feelings that motivated a new leader in the Muslim world, a man known as Saladin, who comes to the fore. Saladin, very interestingly, was part of an ethnic minority in Islam, although he was known to be a fantastic fighter, warrior, and he actually ends up taking over Egypt, one of the major Muslim powers, but then he begins to take warriors from all over the Muslim world and use them as part of his armies against Christians. Saladin, interestingly enough, was someone he was very smart in that he really played up how pious and religious he was among Muslims to get people on his side. He, for instance, would give all sorts of money to Muslim schools and charities just to show that he was someone who really cared about the religion. And in effect, he really ends up, what's interesting enough too is that Saladin was also known to be a very chivalrous knight and played by the rules of knighthood that many people knew from the West. And in fact, he was known to be so chivalrous that many Christians who opposed him could not believe that he was actually Muslim because he was too good. And in fact, the rumors began to circulate among Christians that he had secretly converted to Christianity, which was not true. In any case, Saladin very quickly manages to make life seriously problematic for the European kingdom within the Middle East. He reduces the amount of cities under the control of Christians significantly. And perhaps worse for Christians, he actually takes the city of Jerusalem back for Islam. And interestingly enough, too, in marked contrast with the way that Jerusalem had been taken by Christians, Saladin allowed all the inhabitants to leave with their lives. Not necessarily their property, but they were allowed to leave with their lives when he took the city. There briefly was this sense in the West after they had heard about Saladin's many victories. There's a sense in which they really felt that they had to win the territory back that had been lost in recent battles. And in the Third Crusade, again, a significant army from Western Europe will come over and try to do just that. And the most important figure, I don't think I have his name down, but you know it. This is Richard I, Richard the Lionhearted of England, the king who really is responsible for a majority of the territory that they regained from Muslims. In fact, it'll take a lot back of what had been lost. Here is Richard from this unfortunate, but appears to be a Smurf, but really this is actually meant to be Saladin. And Richard was one of the few people, the English king, who could finally manage to beat Saladin successfully on the battlefield. He was military, he had quite a military mind. Okay. This crusade would actually take back many territories that had been taken previously by Saladin, but one it does not take is Jerusalem. Richard, who was a military man, took one look at Jerusalem and he looked at the men he had and was like, I don't have enough men to take this or to hold it. So he just chooses not to try to take Jerusalem, wisely probably in this case. He does, however, Richard does sit down at the negotiating table with Saladin, and he, even though he can't take Jerusalem, he gets Saladin to agree to allow Christian pilgrims back in the city. They've been forbidden for a period of time. So at least they have access to the holy sites, even if Christians did not own the city. Many of the people back in Western Europe, you may think that this actually was something of a success of the crusade, but many of Western Europe, when they heard they did not take Jerusalem, they felt it was a failure. That had been the main goal. If the Third Crusade, again, is kind of a mixed success, then ultimately, most people tend to think the Fourth Crusade was a complete and total disaster. In fact, and some people think that this begins to tarnish this ideal crusade entirely. In a nutshell, the Fourth Crusade was one more bizarre crusade. What we see initially is that a group of French knights had wanted to go and to attack first, especially Egypt, with the attitude that if they took out Egypt first, then they would be able to have more of a free hand to be able to take Jerusalem after the fact. And so these French knights decided to approach Venetian sailors. The Venetians were known as being one of the great maritime cities, so they could actually supply them the boats to do this. For reasons that we do not entirely understand, when initially the French and the Venetians drew up a contract, the French promised far more soldiers and far more money than they could reasonably actually raise. And so when some of these nobles came back to Venice to say, okay, we're ready to go on crusade now, the Venetians said, you didn't live up to your end of the bargain. But the Venetians were very good businessmen, so they said, how about this? Why don't you guys do a side project with us? And then after we finish with that, then we'll go on crusade after the fact. You can make up your money through our work. They said, fine. What's funny, though, is that what the Venetians had in mind then was that these crusaders, these French crusaders, would help them to destroy something that was, in fact, not actually a Muslim city, but one of these, a Christian city in Hungary that had previously been one of the great commercial competitors with France. So they ended up just sacking that city instead. while they were there, in this Hungarian city, a delegation from the Byzantine Empire, a group, in fact, that felt that its candidate for emperor had been unfairly deprived of the throne of the Byzantine world. They came to this crusading army and said to them, if you help us, we'll reward you with all sorts of money. And so then again, this group of Venetians and French will go and then attack and sack the city, the Christian city of Constantinople. And really leading to a 3-day rampage of absolute destruction in Constantinople. And not just secular items either. The shameless Westerners also stole all kinds of relics and brought them back to Western Europe as well while they were there. And what we're going to see then is that this crusade, this so-called crusade, is never going to actually manage to make it to Muslims. And instead, the French are going to just throw up one of a Western European up temporarily on the throne of the Byzantine world. And many of those Western European allies now will carve up portions of the Byzantine world and rule them instead in their own names. And this is something that's going to, in the long run, is going to help to lead to the destruction of the Byzantine world entirely. That was a good day's work altogether. Now, while Christians were fighting against Christians, they of course had left the Muslims completely free on their own to help to develop their own defenses. And in fact, a new brand of Muslim warrior was just coming to the fore right now. And this is a group that we have not seen previously, known as the Mamluks. Actually, a very interesting story. The Mamluks themselves had been slaves, and they had been bodyguards of the Turks who had ruled over Egypt in particular. In fact, what's going to happen is these Mamluks, who really have been raised from children to fulfill these roles, are going to revolt against their masters, kill them off, and then begin to rule Egypt in their own name. So these were tough cookies, essentially, when they come into power in Egypt. They also, too, they just like Saladin before, the Mamluks, although they really are quite skilled on the battlefield. To give you some idea, by the way, how much, it's hard to believe the horse could even stand up with this much armor, isn't it? But indeed, this is Mamluk armor for horses. The Mamluks also are people who kind of play the game by giving all sorts of money to Muslim charities and giving money for culture and really trying their best to talk themselves up in the Muslim world. Yeah.
Did that actually protect the horses, or was it more just for the look?
Oh, I mean, yeah, it could. I mean, it's similar, in fact, to the kind of armor that was used for people. So, like, for instance, if you shot an arrow at this, it should be able to deflect it. Now, again, you can still shoot out the horse from the legs if you wanted to, but it did provide protection for them. It was the Mamluks, really, who are ultimately going to bring an end to the Crusade movement in the Middle East. But before they did that, before they finally get around to essentially driving out any last vestige of Christians from the Middle East, they had to deal with another problem. And for this, you have to go back several lectures. You'll remember way back when we talked about Mongols and Mongol domination. In effect, the Mongols, the furthest that they had managed to make it in the world was into the Middle East. In fact, they had taken over some of those, exactly, they had reconquered some of the territories that Turks had conquered, now in their own name. In fact, they were coming into the sphere of power of the Mamluks that get close to Egypt. Now, in some ways, the Mongols never did very well in the Muslim world. They really liked ruling over areas in which they could just swap down people easily. The Muslim world, they never quite understood how to rule them very well, and they were always causing all sorts of problems for the Mongols. Finally, though, what brings an end, the Mongols, and really initially, by the way, they completely storm into the Muslim world, like most places that that they get conquered. They would, for instance, the assassins. One of really what brings an end to the assassins, this group, is the Mongols will come and slaughter the entire group. And using some of the same sort of brutal techniques that they had used elsewhere in the world, it appeared now that they were also going to take over the entire Muslim world. Although we know that this hope was completely in vain, many in the Christian world felt, the enemy of my enemy must be my friend. And so there was actually optimism on the Christian side. Maybe Mongols can join our side. I mean, we both hate Muslims. I mean, maybe we can do this together. It was a complete failure, but that was the hope. In fact, Christian delegations went out to try to convert Mongols in part so they could join up and gang up against Muslims. In any case, though, with the Mongol army that makes it close to the Mamluks is not at full capacity. They were to some degree taken aback when the Mamluks sent out a much larger, very skilled army, not being cowed by so many people had been previously against the Mongols. And in fact, the Mamluks win a smashing victory over the Mongols and sends them packing at the Muslim world. At least part of this is now that the legends about the Mongols being completely invincible are gone. They can be beaten. And that, of course, is going to be important for eventually driving them out of the Muslim world entirely. This is why Mongols, you don't have to worry about them. They'll just pull back to Eastern Europe, where in fact they found people much easier to dominate altogether. So they're still going to be oppressively ruling over somebody. So you can breathe a sigh of relief for them. But it's not going to be Muslims. And it's not going to be the leaders of the Muslim world now, the mountains. After the Mongols are driven out, after this threat is gone, there's nothing now to stop the Mamluks. And they bring basically an end to the crusading movement in the Middle East for good. For those of you who like senseless slaughter and destruction, though, there is one last flash of that, even as the Mongols leave this territory. And in fact, a new conqueror who in some ways looks exactly like our friend Genghis, but now a new actual human being, it follows the same rule book, is this guy here, known as Timur the Lame. Just in case you're curious, he actually is physically lame in one of his fights. He's not like lame, not the origin of the name. Genetically speaking, to some degree, we think that Timur the Lame probably was very well suited to his position. He was a combination of both Mongol and Turk blood, and he really had been raised in this warrior culture on both sides. You may never have heard of Timur the Lame, but especially in the late 14th century, just to give you some idea of how large his empire swells in a very short period. He leads this group of disaffected people from many different groups, including Mongols and Turks. He's like, remember the good old days where you used to, kill people and steal stuff? I mean, I can bring that to you again. And so he cobbles together this very interesting sort of ragtag group of people who are really, in some cases, vicious killers. And they really proceed to sort of rip through all this territory in a very short period of time, as you can see, actually bursting into the Muslim world themselves. And among their other defeats, other successes, they'll actually defeat the Mamluks on the battlefield at one point. Timur clearly was someone who at his own time was viewed as one of, really, in some senses, the most vicious of leaders. And again, we've been talking a lot about this class, about these sort of wars that were in part motivated by religion. It's actually very interesting to us to see Timur in that this was a group that could care less about your religion. I mean, they were certainly willing to kill you, Muslim, Christian, Taoist. It really did not matter in their view. So they were equal opportunity killers. Part of the reason why we don't talk about Timur the Lame and this empire cobbled together in a short period of time is because perhaps more so than any empire we've seen so far, there was absolutely nothing positive or any sort of legacy building going on here. This really was sort of pillage and destruction. And so after Timur's death even, there's nothing to hold together this empire. There's no loyalty to it among its subjects. And so even among his own sons, the empire begins to break apart very quickly. Okay. Now, we had started off early on in the class talking about, you'll remember, talking about there had been a threat to the Byzantine Empire. In fact, all of these things we've just been discussing, the Crusades from Western Europeans, the attacks of the Mongols, the attack of Timur the Lame, all of these things collectively had really refocused the energy of the Muslim world. I mean, they had to deal with these more important crises. And so, in fact, the Byzantine world was allowed to continue to cobble on. And in fact, really, the larger threat to the Byzantine world actually proves to be Western Europeans than it does Muslims for a long period of time. When, however, both the Mongols and Timur the Lame were no longer around to make troubles, what it meant was, in essence, that especially the Turks could begin now to refocus their energies back on the Byzantine world. And in fact, this was a Byzantine world now that was very different from the Byzantine world that we talked about at the beginning of the class. And in fact, especially because of its conflicts with Western Europeans, but in fact, the Byzantines had also gotten at least some skirmishes with Muslims. What we begin to see is much of the territory of the old Byzantine world had entirely ebbed away. And in fact, although no one had managed to completely knock them out, they were in a very weakened state. And by the time we get to the 14th century, there's this deepening sense of isolation from many of the Byzantines, and the knowledge, in fact, that things were not going well for them. And in particular, one group of Turks, known as usually the Ottoman Turks, this is basically one sort of branch, you might say, of the Turks, are going to slowly begin to take all of the territory of the Byzantines away, including, again, and obviously should ring bells, modern-day Turkey. But in fact, in time, the Ottoman Turks will completely surround all of the territory of the Byzantines and surround the city of Constantinople. And what the Byzantines are going to find is that with these initial problems we had said centuries before, when they had got the Crusaders in, there was still enthusiasm left in Western Europe to go off on crusade, and at least to some degree to aid the Byzantines. By the time you get several centuries later, everyone had seen what an absolute mess crusading had become. And really, also, no one really liked the Byzantines particularly anyway. It was very difficult now for the Byzantines to drum up support to be able to help them in their dire straits. They were willing to throw money at Western mercenaries to go help them, but they couldn't get enough. We also see there's actually a famous delegation. This is when a Byzantine emperor who actually goes to the Pope, goes to Italy. It's painted by a Renaissance painter. We can see now that the Byzantines were willing even to bend over backwards theologically to appease Western Europeans. So for instance, among other things that they would accept, they would agree, for instance, to accept the authority of the Pope. A position, by the way, I should say that back in the Byzantine world, most people were horrified by it. In fact, they were willing to be conquered rather than to have to bow down before the Pope. And all sorts of theological positions that previously would have been unthinkable, the Byzantine emperor was willing to take, so long as he could get military aid. What we see, though, is that in the face of disaster, though, there's only so many Westerners that would actually agree now to go and aid the Byzantines in their final hour. In effect, what we see is that, again, as a result of not liking the Byzantines or even internal war in the Western European world, the numbers they got were very few. So ultimately what this means is that the Ottoman Turks will then completely surround Constantinople, the city itself, the main city, and everyone knew that that was the key to taking the empire as a whole, bringing an end to it. The ruler among the Ottoman Turks who would bring you the final destruction of Constantinople, the Byzantine world, is this guy here, Mehmet II. Really, Mehmet II, who later on would be known as the Conqueror, made it his absolutely obsessive mission to take the city of Constantinople. What he wanted to do what previous Muslim rulers had failed to do. In effect, we really see that Mehmet II persisted in spite of the many obstacles. And in fact, he really, his casualties were actually quite high, but he did not care. He had to have that city. Now, one of the reasons why previously we think Constantinople had been difficult for Muslim armies to take is that the walls that had been built in the city, walls that now had existed since the time of Constantine, were quite large. It was difficult to send an army straight against it. Even if you tried to destroy them, the walls little by little, they could be repaired. However, luckily for the Ottoman Turks, the age of gunpowder was upon us. An engineer from what today is modern-day Hungary begins to create these enormous cannons to use with gunpowder. Just to give you some idea of how big these things are, supposedly our sources tell us that it takes around 1,000 oxen to move one of these in place. And by the way, they're completely useless. These are not like machine guns. You can move them. You basically have to put them in one place, and that's it. Really, and in fact, a wall was exactly the kind of thing that they would be useful for. In fact, for this battle in particular, they could also only be fired 7 times a day because it took so much time to be able to actually load and clean them after. That it was a very cumbersome process altogether. In any case, we think that these are probably the turning factor, the main factor that allows the Ottoman Turks to destroy the walls of many portions of the city of Constantinople and allows their soldiers to march in before they can be opposed. At this point, the last emperor goes to fight. The last emperor of the Byzantines goes to fight and supposedly dies in the street fighting in the city, which is the way an emperor ought to die. We see at this point that the Ottoman Turks will completely take over the city of Constantinople, turn their church into a mosque, and really end the Byzantines for good. To wrap up, though, there are 2 at least interesting results that happen as the result of the Byzantine collapse. The first, many scholars, Greek scholars, before the city had gone under completely, decided to take all sorts of precious Greek manuscripts and escape to Italy, which to some degree would help to spur on the Renaissance of learning in Italy. The second main result of this on a wider scale is that now this territory ruled by Ottoman Turks is off limits to many Western Europeans, so they hate them. They don't want them to come, and they don't want them to trade in the city of Constantinople any longer, a city that previously had supplied many goods from the Eastern world. Which means that, in fact, Western Europeans still have that same desire for stuff from the Eastern world, but they can't get it here, which is why many Western Europeans begin to think, could we go to the West now to go and to get to East Asia, as opposed to now just going to Constantinople. So that's also going to prove one of the long-term legacies of these comments. All right, folks, we continue on Monday. Remember, quiz on Wednesday. Thank you.